Earth did this one type of story come to completely take over the world?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into. Here's our game plan. First up, we're going to look at why a new kind of story was even needed in the first place. Then, we'll get into the secret recipe that cooked it up in the 18th century. After that, we'll dive into the Victorian era, when things just exploded. We'll also meet some of the heavy hitters, the voices that defined an age, and finally, we'll talk about why the novel still has such a grip on us today.
So, let's rewind the clock. Before the 18th century, if you picked up a popular, respected story, well, it probably wouldn't be about anyone you'd recognize. The main characters and the people reading about them were from a completely different world. For literally centuries, literature was all about the big stuff. You had these epic poems and grand tragedies. They were all about gods, kings, and legendary heroes. You know, people you'd never just meet down at the market. But then things started to shift. Society was changing. A brand new middle class was on the rise. And they were getting more powerful, more educated, and honestly, they were hungry for stories that weren't about gods, but about them. Their daily lives, their struggles, their dreams of climbing that social ladder. And that's where the novel comes in. It was basically invented to fill that exact void. I mean, the name itself comes from the Italian word novella, which just means a little new thing. And it really truly was new. We're talking about a long story written in everyday prose, not some fancy poetry. It was all about characters you could actually believe in, caught up in complex situations that felt totally real, even if the story itself was made up. Now, something like the novel doesn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. It was more like a perfect storm. You had all these different ingredients swirling around in the 18th century, creating the absolute perfect conditions for this new art form to be born. Okay, so what were these ingredients? Well, for one, traditional plays, which had been the main way people got their stories, were kind of fading in popularity. At the same time, you had these things called periodical essays popping up. You could think of them like the hot blogs of the 1700s. They were filled with witty, smart takes on social life and regular people, so folks were getting used to reading about everyday stuff. On top of all that, there was this growing idea that, hey, the lives of common people actually matter. People wanted stories that felt real. The stage was perfectly set, and leading the charge were four trailblazing authors. We're talking about Richardson, Smollett, Fielding, and Sterne. These guys were so important, so crucial to getting this whole thing off the ground that they're now known as the four wheels of the novel. They literally carried the entire genre forward. So, if the 18th century mixed the ingredients and lit the fuse, then the 19th century, the Victorian era, was the massive explosion. This is when the novel went from being this interesting new thing to an absolute world-changing cultural force. And when I say explosion, I mean it. The numbers are just mind-boggling. Think about this. At the start of the Victorian era, maybe 100 new novels came out each year. By the end of it, that number jumped to 1,000, a full tenfold increase. That is just incredible growth. So what was going on? What caused this massive boom? Well, it was another perfect storm, really. You had the Industrial Revolution, which brought in new printing technology that made books way, way cheaper. More people were learning to read than ever before. And then came the real game changer, serialization. Authors started publishing their novels one chapter at a time in cheap newspapers. It was like the 19th century version of a weekly TV show drop. People were totally hooked. And all this new popularity created a huge stage for some of the most famous authors in history. These were writers who grabbed this new art form and used it like a mirror to reflect the crazy, fast-paced, changing world all around them. I mean, you had guys like Charles Dickens, who became the equivalent of modern-day rock stars. His stories weren't about kings, they were about poor orphan boys and struggling factory workers. He built entire worlds filled with characters that this huge new middle-class readership could really connect with. When a new Dickens chapter came out, it was the event. You had to read it. But there's another side to this story, a kind of hidden history. Because while the novel was exploding, a lot of its most powerful and groundbreaking voices had to stay in the shadows. Why? Because they were women. And in that era, a woman writing a novel was just not seen as a serious thing. So to get their work published and taken seriously, they had to hide behind fake male names. You've heard of Currer Bell, who wrote Jane Eyre? That was actually Charlotte Bronte. Ellis Bell, who gave us the unforgettable Wuthering Heights? That was her sister, Emily. And one of the most celebrated novelists of the age, George Eliot, was really a woman named Mary Ann Evans. And these women weren't just writing polite little stories. Oh no, they were tackling huge, controversial issues. Take the youngest Bronte sister, Anne. She wrote a book called The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall about a woman who packs her bags and leaves her abusive husband. Today, that sounds like a brave step, but back then, it was completely scandalous, an absolutely radical idea. That book is now considered one of the very first feminist novels ever. So let's pull all of this together. The rise of the novel. It wasn't just about a new trend in books. It was a flat-out revolution. It was a revolution in who gets to tell the story, and maybe even more importantly, whose story is worth telling. The great writer Henry James put it perfectly. He said, "The only reason a novel should exist is to try and represent life." And that's the key right there. Not the life of some mythical king, but real life. The messy, complicated, wonderful lives of regular people like you and me. The novel basically democratized storytelling. And that powerful, revolutionary idea that your life, my life, is worthy of a great story, that is the novel's real, enduring legacy. It's a legacy we see all around us, in the books we love, the TV shows we binge watch, and the movies that move us. So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If the novel was born to be a mirror for its time, what do our stories, right now, say about us? All right, today we are going on a journey way back in time to uncover the pretty incredible and frankly super unexpected origins of English theater. It's a story that kicks off not in some grand playhouse, but in a place of worship, which, that raises a really fascinating question. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy, right? One is all about quiet, solemn reverence, and the other is about loud, passionate, often bloody drama. But believe me, the connection between them is the very bedrock of every play we know and love today. So, get this. English drama was literally born from Christian church rituals back in the Middle Ages. The very first actors weren't actors at all. They were priests. And the first stage, it was the altar. Now, the key thing to understand is just how integrated these little performances were. They weren't a separate show. They were a living, breathing part of the Mass itself. And it makes sense, right? This was all designed to help a congregation that mostly couldn't read connect with the core stories of their faith in a really visceral way. And it worked. These plays became unbelievably popular. So popular, in fact, that they just couldn't be contained inside the church walls anymore. And this led to a huge shift, taking drama from a sacred ritual to public entertainment. And here we have the actual turning point. A formal decree in 1240 basically opened the floodgates. The plays moved out onto the church steps, and from there, they spilled right out into the bustling heart of the town, the market square. So what did that actually look like? Well, people would build these incredible pageant wagons. Think of them as rolling mobile stages. They'd stage entire plays on them and pull them through town, bringing the Bible to life for everyone to see during big holidays like Christmas and Easter. And this is where it gets really cool, because the whole community got involved. The local craft guilds, the professional unions of their day, took over producing the plays. And they chose stories that fit their trade, which is just brilliant. Of course, the bakers put on the Last Supper, and who better to stage the wedding of Cana than the winemakers? But this kind of folksy, religious drama wasn't going to last forever. A series of massive cultural earthquakes hit in the 1500s that would completely tear down that old stage and build something entirely new and a whole lot darker in its place. So, first up, the Protestant Reformation pretty much put a full stop to these very Catholic-themed religious plays. This created a huge vacuum. At the exact same time, the Renaissance and the rise of humanism meant that scholars were rediscovering these violent, passionate tragedies from ancient Rome, especially from a writer named Seneca. See, in that old medieval mindset, the moral of the story was always crystal clear, and it always came from above. If you broke God's law, divine justice would get you. Simple as that. But these new plays, they were driven by a very, very different engine. And that engine was human revenge. All of a sudden, the focus wasn't on God's justice anymore. It was on human passion, on intrigue, on blood feuds, and on getting even. This massive shift from a divine motive to a human one, it changed everything. This new, explosive kind of drama needed a new kind of home. It needed a space that was built purely for entertainment, and that led to the creation of one of the most iconic buildings in the entire history of theater. Welcome to the Globe Theater. These purpose-built playhouses, people called them wooden O's because of their round shape. They were basically the cauldrons where the plays of Shakespeare and his buddies really came to life.
Now you have to understand, their stage was totally different from what we're used to. We have a picture stage, right? It's framed like a TV screen and it's filled with realistic sets. They had a platform stage, just a simple, bare platform that jutted right out into the middle of the audience.
Because there wasn't any scenery, the whole focus was different. Just like this quote says, the experience was all about listening, not looking. The real power was in the poetry, in the words themselves. The drama was rhetorical.
Just think about what that means. There's no painted backdrop of a castle. There's no elaborate forest set. If the scene was set in a forest, an actor would literally just walk on stage carrying a tree branch. The location, the time of day, the whole atmosphere, all of it was painted with words inside the audience's imagination. But hey, don't go thinking it was boring. What they saved on scenery, they definitely spent on sensation. Death scenes and battle scenes were shockingly realistic. They often used actual animal blood and organs to create some truly gory, visceral special effects. This incredible era, this theater of the mind, was really a unique moment in history. But that pendulum that swung from the sacred to the secular, well, it was about to swing again, this time from the ear back to the eye. Yeah, it wouldn't last. Over the next century, audiences started to want more visual spectacle. They wanted to see the forest, not just hear some beautiful poetry about it. And so, that simple platform stage started giving way to the elaborate picture stage we know today. And you can see this change perfectly in this one little example. About a century after Shakespeare, the super famous actor David Garrick played the Scottish King Macbeth, but he didn't wear simple, historically accurate robes. Nope. He wore a flashy, contemporary scarlet and gold military uniform. Realism and pure spectacle had officially taken center stage. Which kind of brings us to a final thought. We've gone from the church altar to the town square to the Globe's theater of words, and finally to our modern era of spectacle. It really makes you wonder, in our own age of CGI and billion-dollar blockbusters, have we come full circle? Is there a risk that today the spectacle is once again outshining the power of the story itself? It's something to think about.
Today we're going to talk about a real fascinating figure. A man of, well, huge contradictions. We're looking at the 17th century poet Richard Lovelace. He was a soldier, a romantic, totally loyal to his king, and also a prisoner. And it was right from that prison cell that he wrote some of the most powerful lines about freedom you'll ever read. I mean, just listen to that. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. These are, without a doubt, his most famous words. And get this, he wrote them while he was literally locked up for his political beliefs. It's just such a powerful, defiant idea that has resonated for hundreds of years. So, what's really going on here?
That's really the big question we're going to try and answer today. How does a man in shackles become this icon of total liberty? To get the poetry, you have to get the man. And to get the man, you have to understand the chaotic world that he lived in. So Lovelace was what they called a cavalier. And that wasn't just about having cool clothes and long flowing hair. No, it was a whole mindset, a code of honor that guided everything they did, especially when their entire country was tearing itself apart. Here's what you've got to understand about the cavalier way of thinking. For a guy like Lovelace, these three things, loyalty, honor, and love, they weren't separate items on a checklist. They were all woven together. You couldn't have one without the others. Being honorable meant being loyal to your king, and only an honorable man was worthy of his true love's affection. This idea is the absolute key to unlocking all of his work. And you can see from this timeline, his life was completely defined by this conflict. The English Civil War wasn't some far-off event for him. It was the crisis of his lifetime. And his absolute dedication to King Charles I? Well, it cost him his freedom again and again, and eventually it cost him his entire fortune. Which brings us to this incredible conflict that really sparked his most famous poems. And it's a dilemma that I think we can all relate to, right? What do you do when the two things you love most in the world are pulling you in completely different directions? So on one side, you've got Lucasta. That was the poetic name for his beloved, a woman named Lucy Sacheverell. He wrote this incredible collection of love poems all about her. But on the other side, you have his unshakable duty as a cavalier to go and fight for his king. In his poem, To Lucasta, Going to the Wars, he's literally trying to explain to the woman he loves why he has to leave her to go to battle.
And this is how he pulls it off. It's just brilliant. He doesn't say he's choosing duty over her. Not at all. Instead, he argues that doing his duty is the greatest expression of his love for her. By going to war, he's proving that he's an honorable man, and therefore a man who is actually worthy of her love. It's such a clever, perfect piece of Cavalier logic. But, that kind of loyalty comes with a price. For Lovelace, it meant getting thrown in prison. And yet, it was right there, in that tiny, confined space, that he came up with his most powerful ideas about what it really means to be free. The poem is called To Althea from Prison, and it is his absolute masterpiece on this topic. He's physically trapped, but he's writing to his love, Althea, to explain that, his spirit is still soaring. It's just the perfect illustration of his entire philosophy. So how did he do it? How did he feel free? Well, we can break it down into what you could call his 3 freedoms. First up, the freedom of the mind. His imagination could go anywhere it wanted to. No one could lock that up. Second, the freedom of the spirit. His loyalty to his king, his core beliefs, you can't put those in chains. And third, the freedom of the heart. His love for Althea was just as powerful inside those walls as it was outside. For Lovelace, as long as he had those 3 things, he was a free man. Period. So these huge conflicts in his life, love versus duty, confinement versus freedom, they didn't just give us 1 or 2 great poems. They are the engine behind his entire body of work, and they're what cemented his place in literary history forever. And while it's easy to just focus on those prison poems, it's pretty amazing to see his range. He wrote about seizing the day in The Grasshopper. He got all witty and playful about love in The Scrutiny. He wrote these straight-up powerful poems of loyalty, like To the King. And then he could also just paint these beautiful, peaceful pictures of nature and romance, like a total escape from the chaos of his time. And that, right there, is his real legacy. Lovelace took all the intense pressure and hardship of his own life, the war, the love, the politics, the prison, and he spun it into universal art. He basically left us a roadmap for how the human spirit can find its own liberty, even when it's cornered. So that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Lovelace found his freedom in his mind, in his loyalty, and in his heart. He proved that stone walls and iron bars were no match for his spirit. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? In our own worlds, with all of its own pressures and constraints, where do you find yours? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into one of the 17th century's most fascinating and honestly complicated figures, Andrew Marvell. This was a guy who was a poet of incredible passion, a seriously sharp politician, and a quiet philosopher, all wrapped up in one. He basically lived at the intersection of love and war. So let's just jump right in. The thing that makes Andrew Marvell so interesting, the real puzzle here, is this massive contrast. You've got the same mind that wrote one of the most famous, most brilliant seduction poems in the entire English language, and that same guy was also neck deep in the political chaos of the English Civil War. How does that work? All right, let's start with the role he's most famous for, the master of lyric poetry. And you really can't talk about Marvell the poet without talking about his masterpiece, To His Coy Mistress. This poem is the perfect example of his signature style. At its core, the poem is a classic carpe diem argument, seize the day. It's this witty, urgent, and just incredibly clever plea from a speaker to his lover, basically begging her to drop the shyness and just enjoy life and love before, time runs out for them both. And what's so cool is how he builds his case. It's like a lawyer's argument. He structures it in 3 parts. First, he goes way over the top, describing how he would spend hundreds of years admiring every part of her if, they had all the time in the world. Then he slams on the brakes and hits her with the cold, hard reality of death. And finally, he brings it home with this passionate call to action. They have to seize their love right now while they still can. Okay, but this is where the story takes a turn and gets way more complex. Because the guy who could blend all this brainy stuff with such raw, sensual appeal, he wasn't just some lover hanging out in a garden. He was a major player in a country that was literally tearing itself apart with war and revolution. And that brings us to his public life. Marvell wasn't just a poet. He was a member of parliament and a cutting political satirist. So now his writing isn't for quiet reflection. It's a tool, and sometimes it's a weapon, wielded right in the middle of the political arena. Yeah, he was deeply involved in the messy politics of his day. As an ally of Oliver Cromwell, his writing often defended the new government and threw some serious shade at the monarchy. He took that same logical, persuasive mind we saw in his love poetry and aimed it right at the political battlefield. And this quote shows you just how nuanced he was. In his famous poem about Cromwell, Marvell doesn't just write a simple praise song. Nope. Instead, he paints this incredibly complex picture of a leader who is both a history-making hero and a potentially dangerous tyrannical force. It's this masterful deep dive into the nature of power itself. But hold on, beyond the bedroom and beyond Parliament, Marvell had a third world he explored, the quiet, thoughtful world of nature. For him, a garden wasn't just a garden. It was a space for some seriously profound spiritual and intellectual thinking. And he used nature to wrestle with huge ideas. In one poem, The Garden, he presents it as this perfect escape, a place to find peace away from all the human chaos. But then, in another poem, he completely flips it and attacks those perfectly manicured gardens, seeing them as a symbol of how corrupt and artificial people can be. So, how do you connect all these different versions of Marvell? The passionate poet, the shrewd politician, the nature philosopher. Well, the thread that ties it all together is his intellectual style. Marvell was a metaphysical poet through and through. The metaphysical style is all about mashing together deep philosophical thinking with raw emotion. It's known for being super witty and for using these things called conceits, which are basically these wild, surprising metaphors that connect two totally different things to help you think about life's big questions in a new way. These were the tools in Marvell's toolbox, you could say. That same witty argument he used to try and persuade a lover, he sharpened it into biting satire to attack the government. Those same elaborate metaphors he used to describe beauty, he used them to unpack the complicated and kind of scary character of Oliver Cromwell. He proves the same mind can master both the private world of the heart and the public world of power. So what's the big takeaway here? Why are we still talking about this guy centuries later? I think it comes down to his incredible depth and, more than anything, his versatility. The man simply refused to be put in a box. This chart really sums it up perfectly. Look at the range. He took on the biggest themes of human life, from the most private and personal feelings to huge public and political struggles. Reading his work is like getting a panoramic view of this 17th century mind, a mind wrestling with love, power, nature, and what it even means to be human. Ultimately, Marvell's work doesn't give you easy answers. It invites you to think about these huge questions for yourself. He shows us that a single person can contain multitudes, and that's what makes him so much more than a one-poem wonder. So the only real question left is, which side of this brilliant, complicated mind are you going to explore? Welcome to This Explainer, where we're about to uncover the story of a man who was seriously the biggest literary star in England, but, well, you've probably never even heard of him. All right, let's just start with a little pop quiz. Picture it. The 1660s in England. Who's the most famous poet of the day? Who is everybody reading? So, Shakespeare's the first name that pops into your head, right? Well, he'd been gone for decades. Okay, what about John Milton? A total legend for sure, but in terms of pure rock star level fame at that exact moment, nope. The answer was someone else entirely. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're gonna meet this forgotten superstar, dive into his poems about love, see how he tackled politics, check out his philosophical side, and then, figure out why he still matters today. All right, first stop, the man of the hour, the forgotten superstar is Abraham Cowley. He was a true giant in his day, and he was a master of a style they called metaphysical poetry. And get this, the guy was a total prodigy. Born in London in 1618, and he publishes his first book of poems at just 15. 15! His whole career was like that, just hit after hit that had the whole country talking. I mean, he was so famous, he got a huge funeral at Westminster Abbey. That's A-list. Now, to really get Cowley, you gotta understand his style. This metaphysical poetry, it wasn't just, my heart is sad. It was more like a science experiment on sadness. It's all about fusing intense emotion with brainy intellectual wit. They'd use these wild, surprising comparisons, they called them conceits, to really dig into huge topics like love, life, and faith. It's poetry that hits you in the heart and the head. Okay, so you've got the super smart, kind of nerdy style of poetry. How in the world does it handle something as messy and timeless as love? Let's find out. Well, Cowley's answer was a collection of poems called The Mistress, which he dropped in 1647. And let me tell you, it was an absolute sensation. This is the book that really made him a star. And what made it so brilliant was how he mixed things up. He took all those intellectual fireworks of metaphysical poetry, and he smashed them together with this much older tradition, the Petrarchan love poem. You know the type. It's all about dramatic, usually unrequited love, where the person you're into is basically put on a pedestal and worshipped from afar. So what you get is something totally new and incredibly layered. Yeah, he's writing about that classic pain of loving someone who doesn't love you back, but he does it with this sharp, clever wit that was completely fresh. He just nails that feeling, that intense, burning desire clashing with the cold, hard reality that they're just not available. But Cowley wasn't just writing about heartbreak. No way. He was living through one of the most chaotic times in English history, the Civil War. So of course his poetry was going to tackle the huge, messy political themes of his time too. And that brings us to his most massive project, a huge biblical epic called the Davideus. Published in 1656, this thing was a sprawling account of the life of King David. But, and this is the key part, this was way more than just a Bible story. See, Cowley was a hardcore royalist. He was king all the way. He wrote this epic while the actual king, Charles II, was in exile. So by writing about King David, another king who had to overcome huge obstacles, he was sending a pretty powerful political message about the current situation. So in this one giant poem, he's wrestling with these massive ideas: loyalty, exile, hope, redemption, the whole shebang. And he's doing it by mashing up Bible stories with the structure of those old Greek and Roman epics. I mean, the ambition here is just off the charts. Okay, so after all the epic battles and the dramatic love poems, Cowley's leader work takes a turn. He gets a lot more internal, a lot more philosophical. He starts asking that universal question, right? What actually makes a life happy? I mean, think about it. After living through a civil war and becoming a literary celebrity, you can imagine why he'd be thinking about this. And he put all those thoughts into a poem called The Character of a Happy Life. It's a real shift. He's less about the clever wordplay here and much more direct, more philosophical. So what's the secret to happiness, according to Cowley? It's not the fame, it's not the money, it's not your side winning the war, nope. For him, real happiness was all about simplicity and just being content. He talks about inner peace, connecting with nature, which is pretty amazing when you think it's coming from a guy who had seen the absolute peak of fame and fortune. Okay, so we've got Cowley the love poet, Cowley the political epic writer, and Cowley the philosopher. This guy could do it all. So the big question is, if he was so incredibly famous, why don't we talk about him more today? What's his real, lasting legacy? Well, his importance is pretty much locked in, not just for his own poems, but because he was a crucial link. Think of him as a bridge between two completely different eras of poetry. On one side, you have the metaphysical style, all that intellectual, witty, emotionally intense stuff. Cowley was one of the last great masters of that. But on the other side, the neoclassical style was coming in, which was all about clarity, order, and being more elegant and restrained. Cowley stood right in the middle. He blended the old with the new, and that's how he helped steer English poetry into its next chapter. So at the end of the day, it didn't matter if he was writing about love, politics, or just a quiet life in the country. Cowley's poetry always asks you to think. And yeah, his celebrity status might have faded, but that invitation to really engage with the big, profound themes of life, that's a legacy that absolutely endures. So the story of Abraham Cowley, this literary superstar who kind of faded into the background, leaves us with one last fascinating question to chew on. If fame can be this fleeting, what is it that actually makes great art last forever? Today, we're going to talk about a 17th century poet who was also something of an architect. His name was George Herbert, and instead of using stone and wood, he built a masterpiece, a kind of literary cathedral he called the Temple, entirely out of poems. But let me ask you something first. Can a poem actually have a physical shape? I mean, can the way words are laid out on a page create a picture that gives it a whole new layer of meaning? It sounds like something from modern art, right? Well, believe it or not, George Herbert was doing exactly that 400 years ago. So, to really get how he pulled off this incredible mix of word and image, you first have to get to know the man himself. So, let's dive in. Who exactly was George Herbert? Okay, so Herbert was an Anglican priest back in the early 1600s, and his poetry, it's not what you'd call distant or preachy. It's intensely personal, almost like reading his private journal. He gets into all of it. Grace, humility, but also the really tough, messy struggles he had with his own faith. Now, here's what's really wild. His entire life's work, more than 160 poems, was all published in a single book that came out right after he died. He called it The Temple, and that title is everything. For him, the collection wasn't just a book. It was a sacred space, a structure built poem by poem to map out both a physical church and the spiritual journey of a person's soul. And this idea brings us right back to that first question. Herbert didn't just write about a temple, he actually built one with his words. He was a true pioneer of what we now call concrete poetry. You know, poetry you don't just read, you actually see. Let's check out one of the most famous examples of this. It's a poem with a simple title, The Altar. And when you look at it on the page, well, it is an altar. The shape is the poem. This isn't just some clever gimmick. The visual is totally key to its meaning. The words talk about building an altar to God out of a broken heart. So by literally shaping the poem this way, Herbert turns the act of reading into a visual act of worship. It's brilliant. He didn't just build objects either. He could also give a physical shape to huge, abstract ideas. Take, for instance, maybe his most famous poem of all, Easter Wings. And just look at that shape. It's everything. You can see how the lines in each stanza start out long, then get shorter and shorter, squeezing into this point of weakness, of sin, and then they expand back out again. It's a visual journey that perfectly matches the poem's theme, falling from grace and then flying back toward God on the wings of faith. The form and the message are completely fused together. But these cool visual tricks were just one part of his genius. Herbert was just as groundbreaking in how he wrote about the emotional side of faith, that constant, nagging inner conflict. So a huge part of his work is this deep tension, this push and pull that, let's be honest, feels pretty familiar. On one side, you've got this feeling of rebellion, that frustration with your obligations and just wanting to be free. And on the other side, there's surrender, that eventual peace that comes from accepting your path. We see this rebellion just explode in one of his masterpieces, a poem called The Collar. The title itself is a clue. It's not just a shirt collar, it's the priest's collar, the very symbol of the rules and duties that the speaker feels are choking him. I mean, the poem just bursts open with this raw frustration. You can practically see him slamming his fist on the table, yelling, "That's it, I'm done, I'm out of here." He's had it with the rules, with duty. He just wants to live for himself. And from there, the poem is just this frantic, breathless rant. The rhythm is all over the place, the lines are jagged. It really feels like you're listening to someone's thoughts just spiraling. The anger and desperation keep building and building until it all just stops. Right in the middle of this huge tantrum, he hears a quiet voice calling him. And just like that, all that rage, all that rebellion just melts away into 4 simple words of acceptance. After all that fighting, peace doesn't come from breaking free. It comes from surrender. So the collar shows us the human side of the struggle. But what does the other side, the divine response, look like? Well, Herbert gives us the answer in another one of his most incredible poems, Love 3. This poem is the perfect flip side to the collar. Here, the spiritual tension isn't resolved by some dramatic internal battle. No, it's settled by a quiet, gentle, unconditional invitation. Herbert paints this amazing picture of love as a person, a host welcoming people to a feast. The speaker shows up feeling guilty and unworthy, and he tries to leave, but love just gently insists, welcoming him to the table. It's this beautiful metaphor for a divine grace that's offered to everyone, no strings attached, no matter what. So why are we still talking about a religious poet from the 17th century? What is it about George Herbert that still echoes today? Well, his legacy is huge. He was a trailblazer, showing that a poem's shape could be part of its soul. But it was never just about clever forms. His real genius was how he combined that technical skill with such raw, honest emotion. He took these vast cosmic ideas about faith and made them feel personal and relatable. He wrote about doubt, frustration, and grief in a way that still feels completely modern, and he's influenced poets for hundreds of years. And all that really leaves us with one final thought. Herbert showed us that our deepest feelings, our struggles, and our joys could literally take shape on a page. So the question he kind of leaves behind for us is this: if you had to give your own feelings a shape, what would they look like?
Have you ever just looked out at a landscape or maybe up at the night sky and felt this, this deep connection to something way bigger than yourself? Well, that exact search for meaning is what a 17th century Welsh poet named Henry Vaughan poured his entire life into. So let's dive into his world and see how he found the divine in the most ordinary things. Right off the bat, this one line kind of sets the whole mood, doesn't it? It's just packed with this sense of longing, this deep thought about the afterlife, and this powerful idea of light as something divine. This is the heart of his poetry, really, the soul's journey, caught between our world and the eternal. So who exactly was this guy? Well, Henry Vaughan was born in Wales way back in 1621. He was actually a physician and a translator, but it's his poetry that really made his mark. He's part of a group we now call the metaphysical poets. They were known for using their wit and some really complex ideas to tackle the biggest questions out there. Faith, existence, our place in the universe. And right in the middle of his life, he published his absolute masterpiece, Silex Scintillans. And this really gets to the core of his work. See, he wasn't just writing poems for the sake of it. He was on a lifelong quest for the divine. For him, poetry was his way of meditating, his tool for trying to understand that connection between us and God. And he saw these little flickers of that divine light absolutely everywhere. His masterwork, Silex Scintillans, literally translates to the sparkling flint. And what a perfect title, right? Think about it. It's this idea that a divine spark can be struck from something as hard, as ordinary as a piece of flint. The whole collection is about his personal struggle, trying to square his life here on Earth with these incredibly deep spiritual hopes. So, what makes his poetry feel so different? It's this amazing recipe he puts together. He takes this deep, genuine love for nature and mixes it with an almost painful spiritual yearning. His poems aren't big, loud declarations. No, they're more like quiet, personal reflections, filled with these super vivid images, all wrestling with the biggest questions: eternity, redemption, and what it all means. All right, so this brings us to one of his biggest themes, what he saw as nature's divine footprint. For Vaughan, the path to God wasn't just through a church door. Nope, it was a trail that wound right through the Welsh countryside he called home. And this is the key takeaway. A beautiful landscape wasn't just nice to look at. For him, it was a conduit, a direct line to spiritual truth. He really believed that if you just looked closely enough at God's creation, you could start to understand the Creator himself. And you can see this love for his homeland just everywhere in his writing. His collection, Alor Eis Canis, which means the Swan of the Wye, is pretty much a love letter to Wales. And then in poems like The Grass, he zooms all the way in, holding up a single blade of grass as this perfect, humble symbol of God's handiwork. Now, building on that connection to all things pure and simple, we hit Vaughan's second great theme, this powerful feeling of nostalgia, a real longing for the spiritual clarity that he was convinced we all have as children. His most famous poem on this is called The Retreat, and it taps into a feeling that I think a lot of us can relate to, that urge to just escape all the noise and complexity of adult life and get back to something more basic, more real. For Vaughan, that simpler time was also a deeply spiritual time. And this contrast is everything to him. On one side, you've got childhood, a time of purity, simplicity, a time when you're naturally closer to the divine. But on the other side, adult life, he saw it as this maze of complexity and distractions, always pulling us away from that spiritual center. His poetry is kind of a lifelong attempt to find his way back. This leads us right into his third major idea. If nature and childhood are pure, then what's the opposite? Well, for Vaughan, it was the world of adult ambition, the constant chase for wealth, status, and power. To him, it was all just a massive distraction. This thought right here is basically the core message of his poem, The World, and it's such a powerful critique of materialism. Vaughan is saying that all the things we're told to chase, possessions, promotions, praise, they're ultimately empty. True, lasting fulfillment, he says, can only come from your spiritual life. And he's so consistent about this. In The World, he slams the pointlessness of all these earthly goals. And they are all gone into the world of light. He looks past this life completely, picturing the afterlife not as some scary end, but as a beautiful transition into a purely spiritual existence. Okay, so a deeply spiritual guy from the 1600s who loved nature and wasn't a fan of materialism, I get it. But really, why are we still talking about him 4 centuries later? What makes his voice stick around?
Well, here's the wild thing about Vaughn's legacy. It almost didn't happen at all. For a very, very long time after he died, his work was basically forgotten. He just vanished into obscurity.
It's kind of crazy when you look at it. For nearly 200 years, he was a nobody, almost completely lost to history. But then, in the 19th century, something started to shift. A new generation of poets and readers found his work and were just blown away by its depth and beauty. His reputation began to climb, and he eventually landed his spot as a key figure in English poetry. So why does he still connect with us? Well, for one, he was way ahead of his time. He was talking about nature as a spiritual force long before the Romantic poets made it famous. But even bigger than that, his work just gets at something universal, right? The search for faith, the struggle to find meaning, that desire to connect with something more. These are timeless human questions, and Vaughan just offers such a profound and beautiful way of looking at them. In the end, Henry Vaughan's work is this powerful reminder to look for the profound and the simple. He challenged everyone to see the divine not just in some grand cathedral, but in the quiet beauty of the world right outside their door. So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. He found the eternal in a blade of grass. Where do you see it?
All right, let's dive into the work of one of the most brilliant and sometimes baffling poets in the English language, the 17th century master of puzzles himself, John Donne. Get ready, because we're about to see how he used some seriously strange ideas to explore life's biggest questions. I know, it sounds like the setup to a really weird joke, right? But for John Donne, these wild comparisons weren't just for show. They were the actual tools he used to unpack everything, from love and faith to life and death. And that's the central puzzle we're going to solve today. So John Donne was of huge contradictions. Seriously, in his youth, he was this dashing figure, writing some of the most passionate, clever, and honestly steamy love poems you can imagine. But then later in life, he becomes a famous preacher, the Dean of St. Paul's in London, writing these profound, soul-searching verses about God and mortality. So how on earth did he connect those two worlds, the passionate lover and the pious preacher? Well, the answer lies in one powerful signature move of his. It's the secret key that unlocks pretty much all of his poetry. And this is it, the metaphysical conceit. Now, this isn't just a simple metaphor, like love is a rose. Oh no, a conceit is a complex, elaborate, and often shocking comparison that yokes two wildly different ideas together. It's designed to make you stop and go, wait, what? It forces you to see the world in a completely new way. Okay, to make this really concrete, let's look at one of his most famous examples. Donne compares the souls of two lovers who are physically apart to a drafting compass, for drawing circles. He says one soul is the fixed foot in the center, and the other is the one that roams. But no matter how far it goes, they're always connected, leaning toward each other. It's a strange image, but wow, is it a perfect way to describe an unbreakable bond. So let's see how he used this technique back when he was a young poet of love and desire. This is where he really sharpened his wit, creating these startling and, let's be honest, often very persuasive arguments for his romantic pursuits. You've got to love this one. In his poem The Flea, he uses a flea bite as this outrageous argument for physical intimacy. He basically tells his beloved, look at this flea. It bit me, and then it bit you. So our blood is already mingled inside this tiny bug. What you're denying me is no big deal. It's so clever, so shocking, and just 100% John Donne. And he didn't stop there, not by a long shot. In other poems, he imagines lovers as entire worlds unto themselves. He argues that their love is so pure and powerful, it should make them saints. He explores the mysterious connection between the physical body and the spiritual soul in love. It's like a whole new universe built on one of these amazing, mind-bending comparisons. But then his life took a major turn. After a lot of personal turmoil, he becomes the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he takes that exact same intellectual firepower he used on love and aims it at even bigger targets. God, faith, sin, and death. Just listen to this opening line. He doesn't just write about death. He talks to death. He picks a fight with it.
He basically looks this terrifying universal concept in the face and says, "You're not all that." Then he spends the rest of the poem logically dismantling all of Beth's power. It's so bold, so confrontational, and so incredibly personal. And that's really the point. His method never changed, whether he was writing about a lover's glance or his fear of divine judgment. He used that same razor-sharp intellect and those same shocking comparisons to wrestle with the idea until he could make some sense of it. You can see this all over his religious work. His holy sonnets are just raw, honest accounts of him wrestling with his own soul. And works like his devotions were actually written when he thought he was dying from a serious illness. They're these powerful, real-time meditations on the fragility of life. Now here's the wild part of the story. You'd think a poet this brilliant would be celebrated forever, right? Well, not exactly. After he died, Donne's complex puzzle box style of poetry fell completely out of fashion. For centuries, he was mostly forgotten. I mean, look at this. For almost 200 years, he was dismissed as being too weird, too difficult. It wasn't until the early 20th century that a new generation of poets, people like T.S. Eliot, rediscovered his work. They saw his intellectual power and his psychological depth and said, wait a minute, this guy is a genius. And that revival put him right back where he belongs, as one of the all-time greats. So why does a 400-year-old poet still feel so relevant, so modern? I think it's because he looks at life with this incredible, unflinching honesty. He gets that being human means living with tension between our bodies and our souls, between sacred love and earthly desire, between hope and fear. And that really brings us to the final thought. All right, today we are diving into the world of a really fascinating poet from the 17th century, Richard Crashaw. Now, this was a man of incredibly deep, intense faith, but his writing, it's bursting with a kind of passion that might actually surprise you. And yeah, that brings us to the real puzzle of his work. I mean, how does a poet who's writing about God and spirituality end up using language that's just so emotional, so ecstatic, and frankly, so sensual? It's this exact contradiction that makes him stand out, even hundreds of years later. So here's how we're going to unpack all this. First, we'll get to know Crashaw, the man. Then we'll dig into what made his style so unique. We'll explore his biggest work, break down the core themes, and then we'll see where he fits in today. All right, first up, let's get a handle on the man himself. Who exactly was this poet of passionate faith? So Richard Crashaw was technically part of a group called the Metaphysical Poets. But honestly, he was marching to the beat of his own drum. You gotta remember, he was living in a super chaotic time in England, full of religious and political drama, and all of that absolutely shaped who he was and what he wrote. The words that really jump out here are ecstatic and mystical. We're not talking about quiet, polite prayer here. No way. Crashaw's poetry is trying to grab that feeling of being completely overwhelmed by a divine experience, something that hits all of your senses at once. And it's that very intensity that made him such an outlier. So let's talk about how he really broke the mold. Okay, so check this out. Most of the other famous poets of his day were all about being clever and intellectual. You know, lots of witty arguments and brainy comparisons. But Crashaw? He just went in a totally different direction. He cranked up the emotional fervor and embraced this rich, over-the-top style that was just way more dramatic. So where did this all come from? Well, you can boil it down to three huge influences. First, he converted to Catholicism, which was a massive deal and connected him to a whole different European tradition. He was also really into the Baroque art style. You know, think grand, dramatic, emotional stuff. And finally, he was deeply inspired by mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote about her own spiritual experiences in these incredibly personal and passionate ways. And all those threads, they all weave together in his single most important collection of poems. It's basically a roadmap to the heart of his faith. It's called Steps to the Temple, and it came out in 1646. This is his masterpiece. And it's not just a random collection of poems either. The whole thing is structured to take you, the reader, on a spiritual journey. I mean, the title says it all, right? Each poem is meant to be a single step, moving you closer and closer to understanding the divine. He wants you to feel like you're climbing up toward God. It's an active thing, not just something you read. So what are these steps all about? What kind of ground are we covering on this journey? Let's dive into the major themes you'll find in his work.
First up, and this is the big one, is divine love. But the way he writes about it, it's almost shocking. He uses the language of intense earthly romance to try and describe a spiritual love for God. For his time, that was incredibly bold, totally unconventional. But it's not all fire and ecstasy. Crashaw could also plumb the depths of human sorrow. His most famous poem, The Weeper, is all about the tears of Mary Magdalene, and it's just this incredibly powerful piece about grief and the desperate hope for forgiveness. The emotion is so raw, you can almost feel it. And finally, there's this deep, almost overwhelming sense of awe for sacred rituals. Remember, as a convert to Catholicism, he wrote about things like the Eucharist with this incredible reverence. His poetry really tries to make you feel the mystery and power in those moments of faith. So with a style this unique and this powerful, you've got to wonder, what's his legacy been like? Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest. Back in his day, people knew he was doing something new and different. But then styles changed. The next era was all about reason, restraint, and order. And Crashaw's passionate, emotional style, it fell completely out of fashion. For a long, long time, he was mostly forgotten. It really wasn't until much later that people rediscovered his work and started to appreciate his insane ability to describe things that are almost impossible to put into words. And that brings us full circle, right back to our original question. The paradox is actually the answer. Crenshaw's genius wasn't about separating the spiritual from the physical. It was about smashing them together. He seemed to believe that the only way you could even begin to talk about something as huge and infinite as God was to use the most powerful language we have, the language of human passion. So it kind of leaves us with a big question to think about, doesn't it? Are there some things in life, some truths that are so big, so profound, that you just can't get there with quiet, logical language? What can we only really grasp when we push words to their absolute most passionate and even contradictory limits? All right, today we are diving headfirst into the shadowy, cynical, and honestly wickedly funny world of a playwright named John Marston. This guy held up a mirror to society's absolute darkest corners. He was a master of satire, right, during a time of just incredible social turmoil. And you know what? His work is just as sharp today as it was 400 years ago. So, that quote, it really just sets the tone perfectly, doesn't it? Marston's world, it's not about simple heroes and villains. No way. It's all about flawed, ambitious, and just deeply hypocritical people. He saw the world with this biting clarity that made his plays super controversial, but also completely unforgettable. He totally got that virtue and vice are often just two sides of the same corrupt coin. Okay, so to really get Marston, you first have to understand the world he was living in. We're talking early 17th century England, the Jacobean period. And man, it was a time of just intense anxiety. People were worried about who was going to rule next. There was constant political backstabbing and this deep-seated feeling that, the whole world was kind of cracking at the seams. And that whole atmosphere of uncertainty, it was the perfect playground for a satirist. And smack dab in the center of this world was John Marston himself. Now, he was not some quiet writer tucked away in a study. Not at all. He was a provocative, pretty combative figure. He'd look out at the world and just see ambition, lust, and hypocrisy everywhere he turned. And then he put it all right there on stage for everyone to see. And get this, Marston's battles weren't just, theoretical. He was a key player in what's known as the War of the Theaters. It was basically this public feud with other playwrights, especially the famous Ben Jonson. I'm not kidding, they would literally attack each other in their plays, trading these satirical jabs on the public stage. Can you imagine? And that's really what cemented his reputation as this super sharp-tongued and formidable writer. So this really gets to the heart of his toolkit, What made him tick as a writer? Marston's style is just so distinct. He took this incredibly complex, inventive language and smashed it together with a deeply pessimistic view of the world. His plays are filled with this dark humor that, it makes you laugh. And then you immediately have to ask yourself, wait, why am I laughing? He never, ever gave his audience easy answers. He just forced them to sit in that uncomfortable moral ambiguity. And right at the core of all his work is this signature character type, the malcontent. Now, this isn't just some grumpy, dissatisfied person. Oh no. In Marston's plays, the malcontent is a brilliant, witty, and super cynical outsider who uses their position to expose the rotten core of society. They're the truth tellers, even if that truth is absolutely drenched in bitterness. And honestly, there is no better example of this character than in his most famous work, The Malcontent. I mean, this play is the ultimate showcase of his style. It's this dark, tragic comedy that puts this exact character archetype front and center. The whole premise of the play is just ingenious. So check this out. The rightful Duke, a guy named Alto Fronto, gets deposed, kicked out. So he disguises himself as this bitter malcontent named Malevolo and goes right back into his own court, undercover. From that unique position, he gets this totally unfiltered view of all the corruption that's taken over, and he uses his wit to manipulate everything and expose the ugly truth. I mean, this play has everything that makes Marston, well, Marston. It's a really powerful commentary on the toxic relationship between power, betrayal, and morality. It just walks that super fine line between tragedy and comedy, and it perfectly captures the absurdity of a world just filled with ambitious, backstabbing people. But look, Marston wasn't a one-hit wonder. The Malcontent was just one piece of the puzzle. His other plays dive into a whole gallery of human vices, and each one is this sharp, unflinching look at what drives people to do some pretty terrible things. And you can see a really clear pattern starting to emerge in his work, right? Just look at these themes: revenge, lust, hypocrisy, unchecked desire, corruption. Marston was absolutely obsessed with the darker impulses of humanity and how they played out everywhere, from the fancy royal court all the way down to the city streets. And the thing is, he was a master of mixing tones. One moment, a character could be grappling with some deep psychological torment, and then bam, the very next, another character is delivering a line of brilliant, biting satire. This blend of the tragic and the comic is what makes his work feel so chaotic, so modern, and yeah, so true to life. So what happened to this fiery, provocative voice? After a whole career spent dissecting vice, Marston's own final act was a twist that, I promise you, nobody saw coming. I mean, this timeline really shows just how short and explosive his career was. For about a decade, he was one of the most talked about writers in all of London. And then in 1609, he just stopped. He retired from the theater completely and became a clergyman. Can you believe it? The great cynic of the stage dedicated the rest of his life to the church. So, why are we still talking about him 400 years later? It's because Marston's cynical eye feels incredibly, almost shockingly modern. He looked at power and hypocrisy with a kind of skepticism that resonates so deeply today. He showed us that satire isn't just for laughs, it's a weapon, right? It's like a scalpel for dissecting a corrupt world. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Marston's malcontents, they were the witty, bitter outsiders exposing the truth from inside the court. So in our age of social media, of constant online commentary, you have to wonder, have those characters disappeared? Or has their stage just gotten a whole lot bigger? Let's talk about a playwright you might not know, but absolutely should. His name is James Shirley. Here was a guy at the absolute top of his game, a master of both heart-wrenching tragedy and laugh-out-loud comedy. But, as you'll see, the biggest drama in his life wasn't something he wrote. It was the history that almost wiped him from the books completely. So, just imagine for a second. What if every theater, every movie screen, every concert hall just went dark? Overnight. What would happen to all the writers, the actors, and really, the whole creative spirit of a generation? Well, this isn't just a thought experiment. It actually happened. In 1642, right in the middle of the English Civil War, Parliament shut down every single theater, and they stayed shut for 18 long years. I mean, think about that. A single political act that just slammed the brakes on the entire course of English drama. And right at the heart of this huge cultural shutdown was one man, James Shirley. You can really think of him as the last man standing, the final great playwright of an entire era, whose career was hitting its peak right as his world came crashing down around him. So, who exactly was this guy? Well, James Shirley was this really crucial link between two major ages of theater. The plays he grew up with, we call it the Jacobean style, could be pretty wild and intense. Shirley took that raw energy and gave it this polished, elegant makeover. He wasn't writing for the rowdy masses. His plays were super sophisticated, written for the aristocrats hanging out in King Charles I's court, which is why we call it the Carolina era. To really get Shirley, you have to see that he was basically two playwrights in one. So let's dive into Act 1, his world of tragedy. We're talking a dark and stormy landscape filled with political backstabbing, raw ambition, and, of course, bloody revenge. Shirley was an absolute master of a genre that people at the time couldn't get enough of, the revenge tragedy. The setup is pretty straightforward, but always powerful. Somebody gets wronged, they swear revenge, and it almost always spirals out of control until pretty much everyone is toast. And his absolute masterpiece in this genre was a play called The Cardinal, which he wrote just a year before everything shut down. It is this tangled web of political corruption and manipulation, all being pulled by a totally ruthless cardinal. But what makes it so good is its powerful female hero, the Duchess. She just refuses to be a pawn in anyone's game, and she fights back, which throws the whole story into this fascinating moral gray area. It's not just good versus evil, it's messy. So you've got this one world of tragedy, all betrayal, power plays, and murder. But like I said, Shirley was no one-trick pony. He lived in a totally different world at the exact same time. The world of comedy, packed with witty comebacks, romance, and some seriously sharp social critique. And welcome to Act 2. This is Shirley's world of comedy. In this world, the daggers are swapped out for clever insults, and all that dark political scheming gets replaced by the hilarious social drama of high society. His comedic hit was a play called The Lady of Pleasure, and it's this fantastic satire that just roasts the ridiculously over-the-top lifestyles of London's rich and famous. The whole thing is driven by rapid-fire wordplay and some fun, lighthearted romance. But hiding just under the surface, Shirley is landing some serious punches about how shallow that whole world was. He was brilliant at mixing fun with substance, and his range was just incredible. I mean, look at this. He wrote sharp political satires, huge, spectacular shows for the court called Masks, and even tragic comedies that looked at how destructive love can be. This guy wasn't just a playwright. He was a total theatrical chameleon. So here he is at the absolute peak of his powers. He's a master of both tragedy and comedy. He's famous, he's successful. And then it happened. The final act of his career began, not on a stage where he could write the ending, but in the halls of Parliament. This timeline really shows you just how fast it all fell apart. One moment, he's the toast of London for writing the city's favorite comedy. A few years later, he writes The Cardinal, a tragic masterpiece that defines the era. And then, bam! 1642, silence. The theaters are closed, and his career as a playwright is just over. The last great voice of his generation was forced to become a school teacher, completely silenced by politics. Which brings us to one last big question. Shirley had the talent, he had the range, and he had the audience. So if the English Civil War had never happened, if those theaters had never closed their doors, what would his legacy be today? Could he have been a household name right up there with Shakespeare? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many great artists are just one historical accident away from being forgotten? When you think of Shakespeare's London, what comes to mind? Probably kings, queens, epic tragedies, right? But what about everyone else? What about the stories happening right outside the theater doors, on those loud, crowded, chaotic streets? Well, today, we're diving into the work of a playwright who put those exact people, those everyday lives, right in the spotlight. And that's the big question, isn't it? Amidst all the epic tragedies and royal drama, who was actually telling the stories of the regular folks? The shopkeepers, the apprentices, the working class Londoners. Who was writing about their lives? All right, let's jump right in. The guy who answered that call, his name was Thomas Dekker, and he wasn't some distant observer watching London from a palace window. Oh no, he was living it. He saw the comedy, the drama, all the raw humanity of the daily grind, and he thought, yeah, that belongs on a stage. So you can basically think of Dekker as London's street-level storyteller. Seriously, he wasn't writing for the fancy elites. He was writing for the folks in the cheap seats, about the people they saw every single day. He captured everything, the slang, the smells, the hopes, the heartbreaks, and somehow he spun it all into pure theatrical gold. Okay, so what made him so special? For one, he was an absolute master of what they called city comedy, a genre that basically made London itself a main character in the play. But his stuff wasn't just cynical or snarky. His plays were packed with warmth and a real passion for social justice. And you know why it felt so real? Because it was. Dekker himself went through some serious financial trouble, even ended up in debtor's prison. He was writing about the struggles because he knew them firsthand, and that gave his work an authenticity that you just can't fake. So how exactly did this man of the people get all that experience onto the stage? Well, let's take a look at some of his actual plays.
And honestly, they feel less like scripts and more like these living, breathing snapshots of 17th century London. And there is no better place to start than with his absolute smash hit, The Shoemaker's Holiday. This one's from 1599, and it's just, pure joy. It's the kind of feel-good story that just radiates optimism. So why was it such a massive hit? Well, for starters, the hero isn't some boring nobleman. Nope, it's Simon Eyre, this loud, big-hearted, totally lovable shoemaker. The plot is this amazing rags to riches tale, where he actually rises to become the Lord Mayor of London. Think about that for a second. In an age that was completely obsessed with kings and queens, Dekker put a regular working-class guy center stage and made him the hero. That was huge. But Dekker wasn't just about sunshine and happy endings. Not at all. He could also dive deep into the much grittier side of London life. Case in point, in 1604, he co-wrote a play with a title that was basically guaranteed to make people's jaws drop: The Honest Whore. Yeah, in this play, this one shows a totally different side of Dekker, a much deeper, more compassionate writer. The main character, Bellerophon, is a courtesan who is just desperately trying to change her life and escape her past. It's a really surprisingly modern story about redemption and about the impossible choices women had back then. I mean, in a time with such super strict morality, Dekker actually dared to say that maybe, just maybe, a so-called fallen woman deserved empathy and even a second chance. Wild. Okay, so fast forward 400 years. Why are we still talking about this guy? Why does Dekker still matter? Well, it's because when he focused on the lives of ordinary people, he tapped into something that's totally universal. His voice, it still resonates, even today. You see, Dekker wasn't just a playwright. He was more like a social documentarian, but with a serious flair for the dramatic. His plays are basically time capsules. They preserve the sights, the sounds, heck, even the smells of his London. You read one and it's like you're right there. And that's exactly what this quote is getting at. Yeah, the clothes are different, the slang is weird, but the core human drama, it's exactly the same. We're talking about love, ambition, needing your friends, struggling to pay the bills. These are the things that make his work still feel so incredibly alive. So if there's one single thing to take away from all this, it's this right here. Dekker gave a voice to the voiceless. Simple as that. In a time when all the stories were about the rich and powerful, he pointed his spotlight at the regular person, the craftsman, the outcast, and he basically screamed at their lives, their struggles, and their wins mattered just as much. And that kind of brings us to a final thought, doesn't it? Dekker gave a voice to the overlooked people of his day. So as we scroll through our feeds and watch our shows, it's a pretty good question to ask ourselves. Whose stories are we still in danger of overlooking today? Who are our modern-day Simon Eyres and Bellerophons, whose lives are just waiting for their moment in the spot? What is the true cost of ambition? You know, it's a question we've been asking ourselves for centuries, right? In art, in stories, in our own lives. At what point does that drive to get ahead curdle into something, well, something much darker? Well, today, we're going to take a trip back in time to explore that very question. We're heading to the early 1600s in England, to a time known as the Jacobean era. Now, the hope and optimism of the Elizabethan age, yeah, that was fading fast. It was being replaced by this deep, biting cynicism about power and the people who wield it. And we're going to see this dark, fascinating world through the eyes of two playwrights who just got it: John Webster and Thomas Middleton. So who are these guys? Well, they were the ones holding a mirror up to their chaotic times, and they weren't afraid to show the ugly reflection. Let's meet the masters. Okay, so you have these two incredible writers, but they tackled this corrupt world from totally different angles. On one hand, you've got John Webster. They called him the poet of darkness. Think intricate plots, really intense emotional stories, and a whole lot of moral gray area. Then you've got Thomas Middleton, the versatile critic. This guy could do it all, from super grim tragedies to comedies that cut you with their wit, sometimes in the same play. So, what were they actually writing about? Well, let's just say they dove headfirst into the messiest parts of being human. Their plays became this arena for these huge, explosive themes that honestly never get old: power, lust, and corruption. Let's start with Webster. He loved to use historical stories to make a point about his own time. Take his Roman tragedy, Appius and Virginia. It's all about how one powerful guy's obsession with a virtuous young woman, Virginia, can basically tear a whole society apart. The fallout is
devastating. And this is where you really see Webster's genius. He puts his characters, and us, the audience, in these impossible situations. It's not just about one bad guy. It's about a whole system that's rigged to protect the powerful. His plays are always asking these tough questions, like where is the breaking point for honor? What happens when leaders are corrupt? It's this desperate, bloody fight for what's right in a world that seems designed to crush it. Classic Webster. Now, let's hop over to Middleton. He also loved using those flashy, decadent Italian courts as a setting, but he had his own agenda. In his play, Women Beware Women, he uses that backdrop to just surgically dissect the games of manipulation and the quiet, creeping rot of moral decay. So he's covering similar ground to Webster, greed, lust, betrayal, the whole shebang. But Middleton puts this really fascinating spin on it. He totally challenges the gender roles of the time. The women in his plays aren't just helpless victims. Oh no. They are complex. They're agents in their own stories, using seduction and their own wits to survive in a world built by and for men. Middleton was also a master of one of the era's biggest genres, the revenge tragedy. And his play, with the perfectly unsubtle title, The Revenger's Tragedy, is basically a masterclass in how it's done. It's just dripping with cynicism and some seriously dark humor. And get this, the main character's name is Vindich, which literally means revenger. So yeah, he's not just a guy seeking revenge, he is revenge personified. He pulls us right into this twisted world where the only justice you can get comes from violence, and the entire ruling class is completely rotten. Middleton was a team player, too. He worked with another playwright, William Rowley, and together they created The Changeling. This play is just a chilling, brilliant look at psychological fallout, how one single awful decision can make a person's mind completely unravel. The reason people still study this play is because it's so psychologically complex. You literally watch a character make a deal with the devil, so to speak, and then you see the guilt and madness just infect her soul like a virus. And just when the tragedy is about to overwhelm you, Middleton hits you with this dark, almost bizarrely funny subplot that somehow makes the main story feel even more nightmarish. But hey, just when you think you've got Middleton pegged as Mr. Doom and Gloom, there's a twist. He had this whole other side. He was also a razor-sharp satirist, and he turned that critical eye away from Italy and onto the streets of his own city, London. And to get this side of him, you have to know about a genre called city comedy. Basically, think of it as the 17th century equivalent of a roast. The target? The money-grubbing, hypocritical, social-climbing citizens of London. And Middleton's absolute masterpiece of the genre is A Chaste Maid in Cheapside. By the way, the title is the first joke, because chastity in this play's world is, let's just say, a very rare commodity. In this play, humor is his weapon. He just skewers London's obsession with money, where marriage is basically a business deal and your social status is everything. He peels back the curtain on polite society to show the moral decay festering just underneath. So, all of this brings us to the big question, right? These plays are 400 years old. Why on earth are we still talking about them? What makes them endured? With Webster, his legacy is that incredible psychological depth. This guy was fearless. He wasn't afraid to explore the darkest parts of the human mind. And he created these unforgettable characters who stood up to corrupt systems and forced audiences to really think about the nature of power. His work still hits home because he just understood what makes people tick. And Middleton's legacy? It's his absolutely insane range. He was a true innovator, a brilliant social critic who could weave satire and tragedy together like nobody else. When you look at his body of work, you get this incredibly rich, well-rounded picture of the human experience. And really, that's the bottom line. Their plays stick with us because they plug right into conversations we're still having today. Just like this quote says, the struggles with right and wrong, the abuse of power, the questions about who we are, those things are just as real for us now as they were back in Jacobean England. So I'll just leave you with this final thought. When you look at our world today, with all of its power struggles, its moral gray areas, and that constant, relentless drive for ambition, you have to ask yourself, are we really so different from the characters who walked that Jacobean? All right, let's talk about tragedy. Now, you might think Shakespeare had the market cornered on tragic drama, but today we're diving into the work of John Webster. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, but let me tell you, his vision of the world was, in many ways, even darker and more intense. At the very heart of Webster's work is this one single explosive question. What really happens when a person's desire for love goes up against the crushing force of absolute power? It's a conflict that fuels his most famous play, and, it's a theme that still feels incredibly relevant today. Okay, so to really get Webster, you have to get his time period. We're talking about the Jacobean era. This is the early 1600s, right after Queen Elizabeth I. And while Shakespeare was also writing, Webster was looking at the world through a much bleaker lens. His world is often violent, cynical, and feels pretty morally corrupt. So who was this guy, really? John Webster was an absolute master of the psychologically intense tragedy. His plays aren't just about bad things happening to people. No, they're deep dives into the minds of his characters who are twisted up by ambition, by jealousy, by obsession. It's like he's showing us not just what they do, but the dark, disturbing logic behind why they do it. Think of his plays as these intricate, perfectly constructed traps. Webster creates these brilliant, complex characters, and then he just ensnares them in these suffocating webs of political scheming and personal betrayal. And the plots, they are shockingly violent. It all paints this picture of a world where moral decay feels, almost inevitable. His two big masterpieces, The White Devil and The Duchess of Malfi, are both set in the corrupt courts of Italy. Now, for writers of his time, Italy was kind of the perfect backdrop to dissect power, revenge, and hypocrisy. And while The White Devil's amazing, it's The Duchess of Malfi that is really considered his greatest achievement. So for this explainer, that's the one we're going to break down. All right, let's put this play on the operating table, shall we? By performing a kind of anatomy of a tragedy on The Duchess of Malfi, we can see exactly how Webster built his dark and totally compelling vision of the world. So, the setup sounds deceptively simple. The play centers on a young, wealthy duchess who's been widowed. She's powerful, she's independent, but she makes one fateful decision. She decides to go against the explicit wishes of her powerful brothers and secretly marry the man she actually loves. A man who is, by the way, way below her in social status. And this single act of defiance is like lighting a fuse on a powder keg. It sets off a catastrophic chain of events. And to understand why it was so explosive, we've got to meet the key players in this very deadly game. Just look at how these motivations are on a collision course. On one side, you've got the Duchess. All she wants is autonomy, love, happiness. Pretty simple stuff. But against her, you have her brothers. The Cardinal, who is the embodiment of cold, corrupt power, and then her twin, Ferdinand, who is driven by this really disturbing, obsessive need to control her. And caught right in the middle, a spy named Basola, who is maybe the most complex character of all. So it all starts here. The Duchess marries her steward, Antonio. In a world obsessed with bloodlines and status, you just can't overstate how radical this was. A noble widow was supposed to be a pawn in her family's political games. By choosing her own husband for love, the Duchess is basically saying, my life, my body, my choice. And her brothers, they do not see this as a love story. For them, her choice is a stain on their family's honor and a direct threat to their control. They had forbidden her to remarry, and her defiance just unleashes their absolute darkest impulses, especially Ferdinand's. He just goes completely off the deep end. So what do? They plant a mole in her court. That's Basola. And right away, the whole play shifts into this tense, claustrophobic thriller. It's all about surveillance and manipulation, as the Duchess desperately tries to keep her marriage and her children a secret from the world that wants to destroy them. But yeah, in a Webster play, secrets have a very short shelf life. When her marriage is finally discovered, her brother's revenge is swift, and it is absolutely sadistic. The Duchess is put through unimaginable psychological torture before she's finally executed. It's a truly brutal punishment for daring to defy them. And this comparison just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you have the Duchess's world, which is all about modern values, autonomy, love, personal happiness. And on the other, her brother's world, which is this rigid patriarchal system built on power, lineage, and total control. I mean, these two worlds were never going to coexist. They were destined to collide violently. But look, this story is way more than just a family tragedy. For Webster, the Duchess's story was the perfect vehicle to explore all the big themes that he was completely obsessed with throughout his career.
Yeah, you can think of this play as a pressure cooker for all his biggest ideas. The corrupting influence of power is everywhere. Ferdinand's jealousy becomes this terrifying, monstrous force. And at its core, the play is just a blistering critique of a social system that tried to control women's lives. And all of it is just steeped in this dark, gothic imagery of death and madness. You know, a critic once summed up his work perfectly, describing it as taking place in a world where human suffering and treachery reign supreme. And that just hits the nail on the head, right? Webster doesn't give you easy answers. He just forces you to look at the worst parts of human nature without any kind of moral comfort. So you might be thinking, wow, this sounds incredibly bleak. Why on earth are we still studying and performing John Webster 400 years later? What makes his dark vision last? Well, the answer really comes down to his sheer skill. Webster's language is just stunningly poetic, even when he's describing horrible things. It has this quality that people call a macabre beauty, and his characters, from the noble Duchess to the conflicted spy Bosola, they are so psychologically rich that they feel completely, terrifyingly real. Ultimately, Webster's legacy is that of a challenger. He put a female hero on stage who demanded a level of personal and sexual autonomy that was just shocking for its time. By questioning who gets to have power and exposing the rot that can lie underneath it, he created this powerful, unforgettable kind of tragedy. Which really leaves us with one final thought. The Duchess of Malfi fought for the right to choose her own life, her own love, against a system that was designed to crush her. And it makes you wonder, 400 years later, in our own world, who gets to write the rules for love and power? And what happens when we dare to defy them? You know, when you think about English Renaissance drama, there's really one name that just towers over everything else, right? Shakespeare. His genius basically defined an entire era. But that incredible dominance brings up a really fascinating question about what was happening in the world of Jacobean theater. So, what does happen when the biggest creative force of a generation finally puts down his pen? I mean, who could possibly step into a shadow that massive and still capture the imagination of London's audiences? It's a huge challenge for sure, but the answer, well, it might just surprise you. You see, the answer wasn't some single playwright trying to fill those impossible shoes. Nope. Instead, the future of the London stage was actually shaped by one of the most celebrated and successful collaborations in the history of English theater, a true power duo. So, let's meet them, Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher. These two guys, working together in the early 1600s, became the new rock stars of the London stage. But here's the key. They didn't do it by just trying to imitate the master. They did it by inventing something completely new for audiences to fall in love with. Their success wasn't built on just, writing a funnier comedy or a more tragic tragedy in that familiar Shakespearean style. Nah, their real genius was in forging an entirely new genre, a kind of hybrid storytelling that was perfectly in tune with the changing tastes of their audience. They popularized what's called the tragic comedy. It was a totally new emotional roller coaster for people in the theater. Just imagine a play that gets your heart pounding with these huge life or death stakes, but then it brilliantly weaves in sharp humor, romance, and crazy plot twists that lead not to a stage littered with bodies, but to a really satisfying, happy ending. And their formula? It sounds simple, but man, it was incredibly effective. You start with a conflict that feels truly tragic. We're talking political conspiracies, devastating betrayals, the works. Then you pepper it with witty dialogue and shocking reveals that keep the audience guessing. And finally, just when you think it's all going to end in tears, they pull it back from the brink and give everyone a resolution that leaves them feeling relieved and just totally exhilarated. Okay, so that's the theory. But what did this new formula actually look like in action? Well, their most famous plays were absolutely packed with these intense plots of passion and power, full of moral dilemmas, romance, and a ton of political intrigue. First up, let's look at The Maid's Tragedy. Now, don't let the name fool you. This play is a perfect showcase for how they blended that intense drama with really complex character conflicts. It's a story all about honor, betrayal, and the abuse of power. So get this for a setup. There's this loyal nobleman, Amintor, and his king forces him to break off his own engagement to marry a woman named Evadne. But here's the devastating secret. Evadne is actually the king's mistress, and this whole marriage is just a sham to cover it up. I mean, what an impossible, horrible situation, all fueled by corruption at the very top. And really, what the play explores are the devastating ripple effects of one man's unchecked power. It's not just some simple love triangle. It's about how that moral rot at the top just poisons the entire court and forces good people into making terrible, terrible choices.
All right, next, let's check out Philaster. This one leans way more into the romance and intrigue that made their tragicomedies so wildly popular. I'm telling you, this one has it all. A stolen throne, a secret love affair, and a brilliant case of mistaken identity. So, at its core, this is a political drama. On one side, you've got Philaster, the beloved and rightful heir to the throne. And on the other, the guy who stole his crown. And to make things even more complicated, Philaster is in love with the usurper's daughter, Arethusa.
And here, this is where you really see Beaumont and Fletcher's mastery of the plot twist just shine. The story gets all tangled up in false accusations of cheating and, most famously, this brilliant disguise. Philaster's loyal page boy, Bellario, is secretly a woman who is hopelessly in love with him. It's exactly this kind of complicated, emotional, twisty plotting that audiences back then just went crazy for.
So, okay, their plays were undeniable blockbusters, and their style was incredibly influential. But what does that really mean for their place in history? Well, as we're about to see, they left a lasting legacy that is way, way bigger than most people realize today.
If you only take away one fact to understand just how important these guys were, let it be this one. After Beaumont retired and Shakespeare passed away, who did the most famous acting company in the world, the King's Men, turn to be their main playwright? John Fletcher. He literally took over Shakespeare's job. In their own time, Beaumont and Fletcher weren't just popular. They were considered Shakespeare's equals, and for a while, they were even seen as more fashionable. So let's just recap their impact here. They pioneered a blockbuster new genre that audiences loved. They absolutely perfected the kind of twisty, surprise-filled plots that, let's be honest, we still love today. They created these really complex characters who were wrestling with deep moral and psychological issues. They proved you could blend high-stakes drama and sharp wits seamlessly. And their style was so dominant that it shaped English theater for decades, well into the next historical period. Which, of course, leaves us with one final big question. For a time, Beaumont and Fletcher were the absolute kings of the English stage, every bit as famous and respected as Shakespeare himself. Their work was innovative, it was popular, it was massively influential. So, why is one name remembered by literally everyone, while this incredible powerhouse duo has kind of become a topic for specialists? It's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? About how history ultimately chooses its heroes. Today, we're diving into the pretty chaotic world of 16th century England to talk about a theologian named Richard Hooker. And trust me, his ideas about reason, tradition, and faith didn't just shape a church, they ended up influencing Western thought for centuries. So, let's start with a huge question. How do you stop a religion from literally tearing itself apart? I mean, this was the absolute burning question of Hooker's time. The Church of England was stuck in this vicious tug of war, with different sides threatening to just shatter the whole thing. How could anyone possibly find a path forward? Okay, to really get Hooker, you have to understand the crisis he was staring down. After breaking away from Rome, the Church of England was basically having a massive identity crisis. The pressure was just immense. You had people who wanted to go back to the old Catholic ways. And then you had this new, fiery movement that wanted to purify the church of all that stuff completely. And this slide just lays out the conflicts so clearly. On one side, you've got the Puritans. Their argument was pretty simple. If it's not explicitly in the Bible, get rid of it, period. But on the other side, the established church was defending its traditions, its ceremonies, its whole structure with bishops. It was a total clash of absolutes, and there was really no middle ground in sight. And right in the middle of this firestorm, you have this one guy, Richard Hooker. He was a priest, a theologian, and he saw just how dangerous this extremism was. He looked at all of it and thought, there has to be another way. A more thoughtful, more stable path that doesn't involve destroying the church just to save it. And finding that path, well, that became his life's work. Hooker came up with something known as the Via Media, and this idea would become the intellectual cornerstone of the entire Anglican Church. So, Via Media is just Latin for the middle way. But don't let that fool you. This was not some lazy compromise. Not at all. It was this really sophisticated, deep argument for a balanced church, one that could navigate between the super rigid authority of Rome and the equally radical demands of the Puritans. It was all about carving out a space for a faith that was uniquely English. And this quote right here, this gets to the absolute heart of it. Hooker's big idea was that God gave us brains for a reason. Faith wasn't about switching off your intellect. No, it was about using that God-given ability to reason to better understand God's law and the world you live in. So, how did he actually structure this? Well, Hooker laid out this brilliant and, as it turns out, incredibly durable framework for authority. He argued that it shouldn't rest on just one leg, but on three really sturdy pillars.
And this just illustrates his thinking perfectly. So, pillar number one is scripture. Of course, that's the foundation, the bedrock. But, and this is the key, it wasn't the only source of authority. Pillar two was tradition. All the collected wisdom of the church passed down for generations. And finally, pillar three was reason, our ability to think logically and figure things out. For Hooker, these three weren't in conflict. They were a team, working together in harmony. Let's be really clear here. This was a huge deal back then. In an age of intense religious dogmatism, Hooker was making this powerful case for using your mind as part of your faith. He was arguing that things like rituals or how the church was run could be totally fine even if they weren't in the Bible, just as long as they didn't contradict it and were backed up by tradition and sound reason.
Hooker's ideas didn't just fix the problem in front of him, they echoed through the centuries, and they created this profound, lasting legacy. So let's take a look at how. Well, for starters, his major work became the defining text for Anglicanism. It gave the church its theological identity. It also provided a really solid defense for the church's structure and all its practices. But his influence went even further. It helped shape English political ideas about law and government. And he ended up being this crucial link between medieval thought and the beginning of the modern era. So look, if you take just one thing away from this, it should be this. Richard Hooker's genius was that he brought things together. He totally refused to accept that you had to choose between scripture and reason, or faith and tradition. Instead, he built a tent big enough for all of them, and in doing so, created a vision for the church that was both balanced and incredibly resilient. And that leaves us with one last question, doesn't it? Hooker's challenge was finding a middle way through the extremism of his day. Now, more than 400 years later, in a world that often feels defined by rigid, opposing sides, his search for a balanced path, one guided by reason, wisdom, and core principles, feels more relevant than ever. So it makes you wonder, where do we find our Via Media? Okay, so today we are tackling one of history's most dazzling and, most complicated figures, Sir Walter Raleigh. This guy was the absolute definition of an Elizabethan-era rock star, an explorer, a poet, and, as we'll see, a man accused of being a traitor. And that really brings up the big question, right? How does someone who is the absolute favorite of the most powerful monarch in the world, Queen Elizabeth I, end up locked away in a prison, staring down an executioner? It's a story of incredible highs and some really devastating lows. All right, let's get right into it. In this explainer, we're going to trace that exact path for you, from the glamour of the royal court and the wild adventures in the New World, all the way to the cold stone walls of a prison cell. So, first things first. To really get Sir Walter Raleigh, you have to understand the time he lived in. He was what we'd call the quintessential Renaissance man, a person who just seemed to excel at everything he tried. And I mean, just look at this list. He was an adventurer, charting totally unknown lands, a soldier fighting for his queen and country, a truly gifted writer and poet, and on top of all that, a slick courtier who knew exactly how to play the game of royal politics. The guy literally did it all. Okay, so how does a guy with all these talents actually make it big? Well, this is where Raleigh's star just completely took off. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, his ambition and his charm just launched him right to the very top. Think about this. In just over a decade, what he pulled off was honestly staggering. In 1585, he's bankrolling the Roanoke colony in Virginia, which he named for the Virgin Queen, by the way. Smart move. By 1591, he's penning these passionate poems for her. And by 1596, he's publishing these incredible, thrilling stories of his own explorations. And here's what's so fascinating. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he talked about it. He wasn't just exploring, he was selling a dream. Just listen to how he describes Guyana, a large, rich, and beautiful empire. He's painting you a picture, and he wants you to buy in. And that's the real kicker, right? This book, it wasn't just some travel journal. Nope, it was basically a glossy marketing brochure. Raleigh was a sharp operator with huge ambitions, and he used his writing to get investors excited about this land just overflowing with gold, ripe for the taking. But you know how these stories go. What goes up must come down. And Raleigh's fall from grace was fast, and it was brutal. His golden age was about to hit a brick wall. So why? What happened? Well, this slide tells you everything you need to know. Raleigh's entire career, his entire fortune, was tied to Queen Elizabeth. When she died and King James I came to power, everything changed. Raleigh was out, and the new king had him arrested for treason. 13 years. 13 years. Can you even imagine that? The world-traveling explorer, the celebrated poet, the Queen's favorite, now confined to the Tower of London. But you couldn't silence a mind like Raleigh's with just stone walls. In what has to be one of the most incredible acts of intellectual defiance ever, he used that time in prison to write his most massive work, The History of the World. Think about that. He's analyzing the rise and fall of empires and the nature of power, all while being a political prisoner himself. And that really brings us to what he left behind. Because even though his political career and his colonial dreams ended in tragedy, his power as a writer, that made sure he would never, ever be forgotten.
Just take this opening line from his incredible poem, The Lie. It's so powerful, so direct. He's literally sending his soul out into the world on a mission to expose the truth.
And what's driving that poem is this deep, profound sense of disillusionment. I mean, this is a man who saw the very height of power and the absolute depths of betrayal. So he uses his poetry to just rip into the hypocrisy and lies he saw all around him, from the church right up to the royal court.
And you know, even in the stuff he wrote for his son, he left behind this very clear philosophy for how to live. And if you boil it all down, the big takeaway is his belief in a life guided by virtue. He stressed chasing knowledge, having real moral courage, and above all else, acting with total integrity.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Explorer, poet, traitor. So what was he? A flawed hero? An ambitious colonizer whose dreams just got too big? Or was he a brilliant, one-of-a-kind mind who was ultimately just a casualty of shifting political winds? His story doesn't give us any easy answers, and honestly, that's exactly what makes him so fascinating. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. That's from the great poet John Keats, and he's describing that incredible, mind-blowing feeling of discovery. But here's the thing, he wasn't looking through a telescope, he was reading a book. So that begs the question, right? Who on earth was this Chapman? And what was it about his version of Homer that could make one of the greatest poets ever feel like he just discovered a new planet? Well, let's get into it. Today, we're unlocking the story of George Chapman, the man behind the translation that absolutely electrified John Keats. Okay, so to really get a handle on Chapman, we have to see the massive ripples his work sent out. We're going to start by looking at him through the eyes of the people he inspired. So who was he? Well, George Chapman was a total Renaissance man, a poet, a playwright, and a translator. He had a reputation for being, well, a little difficult. His writing was dense, intellectual, and full of deep, complex ideas. He wasn't just writing for entertainment, he was grappling with the biggest questions of his time. And if we look at his poetry first, you see this incredible range. This is a guy who wasn't afraid to tackle the big stuff, the real extremes of human experience, from passionate love to the darkness of death. And you can totally see this in his work. On one hand, you've got The Shadow of Night, which is this deep, dark dive into mortality and loss. But then, just a few years later, bam, he writes The Blinded Cupid, all about the crazy, blinding power of love. Talk about versatility. And get this, his talent was so respected that he was given this huge task, finishing Christopher Marlowe's epic poem, Hero and Leander, after Marlowe died. And Chapman didn't just wrap up the plot, he layered in all this philosophical depth about love and destiny. But Chapman wasn't just a poet for the page. Oh no, he brought that same intensity to the stage. As a playwright, he was all about tragedy, exploring the high-stakes world of ambition, political power, and, the unavoidable hand of fate. He wrote some seriously powerful tragedies, like Bussy d'Amboise and The Tragedy of Caesar and Pompey, but his plays about the Duke of Biron are a perfect showcase of his signature style. His tragedies kind of have this classic recipe, right? You start with a hero who has these big, noble ambitions, but then he gets caught up in all the political backstabbing, his own pride gets the better of him, and it all leads to a huge, tragic, and you saw it coming downfall. And just when you think you've got him pegged as this super serious tragedy guy, nope, he flips the script and writes a comedy called All Fools. It's this sharp, funny satire about all the ridiculous things people do for love and status. The guy could really do it all. Okay, so all of this brings us to the absolute peak of his career. The work that would echo through the centuries and grab the attention of a young John Keats. We are, of course, talking about his epic translations of Homer. Now you're probably thinking, hold on, Homer's poems are ancient. They were already around. And you're right. So what was the big deal? Well, Chapman did something revolutionary. He didn't just translate the words, he translated the feeling, the power, making these old stories feel brand new and totally alive for his audience. And this was not a quick job. This was a lifelong passion project. He started publishing bits of the Iliad way back in 1598 and didn't finish the whole thing until 1611. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he followed it up with the complete Odyssey in 1616. Just let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about one epic poem. We're talking about two of the absolute cornerstones of Western literature. The sheer scale of what he accomplished is just wow. And this is the magic of what he did. He took the original Greek and injected it with this soaring poetic grandeur. He infused the ancient story with the energy and spirit of his own time, the Elizabethan era. He turned a dusty old text into a living, breathing masterpiece for English readers. So what Chapman did, it wasn't just a literary project. It was like he built a bridge across time. And his work would go on to shape English literature for hundreds of years. Which brings us right back to where we started. That feeling Keats had of discovering a new planet, it came from reading Chapman's Homer. The title of his poem is literally a shout out to the man who opened up this whole new universe for him. Chapman's legacy, it's just huge. I mean, he didn't just inspire Keats, he laid the groundwork for titans like John Milton. Later translators like Alexander Pope saw Chapman's work as the gold standard. He basically helped make the classics a fundamental part of English culture. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. Chapman's story really makes you wonder, what's more powerful in the end? The original story itself, or the voice that finds it and gives it a powerful, breathtaking new life for a whole new world? Okay, when you think of English Renaissance drama, I bet one name just pops into your head, right? Shakespeare. But what about his greatest rival? Today, we're going to dive into the world of Ben Jonson. He was brilliant, sharp, and hugely influential, a real titan of literature who absolutely carved out his own path. You see, it's fascinating because Jonson was playing a completely different game than Shakespeare. I mean, where Shakespeare gave us this incredible, fluid exploration of the human heart, Jonson, he was all about precision. He wasn't just telling stories. Oh no, he was more like a social critic, using his plays like a scalpel to dissect human folly and, teach a lesson. So the big question is, how did this guy, this master of kind of formal, instructive satire, become a theatrical rock star? What was his secret sauce? Well, it all started with this one revolutionary idea that completely, and I mean completely, changed the game for English comedy. All right, so Jonson's first big splash on the London theater scene was this brand new genre he basically championed called the comedy of humors. And you have to understand, this was radical stuff. At the time, all the stages were just flooded with romantic comedies. Jonson comes along and offers something totally different, a psychological framework for his characters that felt almost scientific, and bam, it cemented his reputation practically overnight. So the theory behind all this, it's actually fascinating. Jonson basically borrowed this idea from ancient medicine. The belief was that our personalities were governed by the balance of 4 fluids in our bodies, what they called humors. Too much blood and you were super cheerful, maybe a little naive. Too much black bile and you were gloomy and melancholy. Jonson took this exact concept and just plopped it right onto the stage. So let's see how this actually played out on stage. Take his breakout hit, Every Man in His Humor. The characters are all driven by one single dominant trait. So you've got this young guy, well-bred, who has way too much blood, which makes him gullible and super easy to manipulate. And then you get the crafty servant, Brainworm. He's this master schemer who uses everyone else's predictable humors against them, and the result is just brilliant comedy. Okay, so with the comedy of humors, Jonson had really found his voice, and he used it to create some of the most biting, hilarious takedowns of human greed and corruption ever written. This was him at the absolute peak of his power. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the essence of his masterpiece, Volpone, which means the fox. The play is just this brilliant, cynical, and hilarious look at what happens when the pursuit of wealth totally corrodes a person's soul. I mean, it's a comedy, sure, but wow, it reveals some seriously dark truths about human nature. So let's break down this incredible con, okay? First, you've got Volpone, this rich nobleman who pretends he's on his deathbed. This, of course, attracts a whole circle of greedy vultures, a lawyer, a merchant, you name it. And they all start showering him with expensive gifts, hoping they'll be named the sole heir. And the whole time, pulling all the strings is his servant, Mosca, who might actually be even more cunning than his master. The whole play is just a masterclass in manipulation. So just 4 years later, Jonson struck gold again, literally. This time, he turned his satirical eye right onto the city of London itself. His next play, The Alchemist, dives headfirst into the world of con artists, and well, the desperate and foolish people who fall for their tricks. At the heart of this play is this just unforgettable trio of swindlers. Okay, so you've got Face, the servant, who's running the whole operation while his master's out of town. He teams up with Subtle, a charismatic but totally fake alchemist, and their accomplice, Dol Common. And from the master's house, they promise this whole parade of gullible clients the one thing everybody desires: a philosopher's stone that can turn base metals into pure gold. It's frantic, it's brilliant, and it's a deeply funny look at just how foolish people can be. But here's the thing. Johnson was so much more than just a master of comedy. His influence spread across all kinds of genres, establishing him not just as a great playwright, but really as a foundational figure in English literature as a whole. I mean, just to prove his incredible range, Johnson also wrote these super serious historical tragedies. Plays like Sejanus's Fall used all the political drama of ancient Rome as a way to explore the ambition, betrayal, and corruption happening right in his own time. And he didn't stop there. He was also a huge innovator in royal entertainment. Johnson pretty much invented the court mask, which was this incredibly extravagant spectacle for the rich and powerful. It combined poetry, crazy stage designs, music, dance, the whole 9 yards. His Mask of Blackness, for example, was a massive hit in King James's court. And just when you think you've got him figured out, you discover this whole other side to him. The same sharp-tongued satirist was also a master lyricist. He wrote some of the most famous and beautiful love poems of the era, like the timeless song to Celia. I mean, the guy's talent was just immense. So when you look at his legacy, it's just so multifaceted. He was a great playwright, a celebrated poet, and on top of all that, he was a trailblazing literary critic. His book Timber, or Discoveries, laid down some of the foundational ideas of English literary criticism. It literally shaped how we've talked about literature for centuries. His influence was so profound that a whole generation of younger writers, we're talking people like Robert Herrick and John Suckling, proudly called themselves the Sons of Ben. And this wasn't just some fan club. They saw him as a mentor, as the leader of a literary movement. His style, his precision, his wit, that was the gold standard. He wasn't just a writer, he was an institution. And you know what? The establishment certainly agreed. Johnson became one of the very first writers to get what was basically a royal pension. And then he was given the ultimate honor for an English writer. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. That's it. He had officially made it into the literary canon for good. So it's clear, right? Ben Jonson was an absolute master satirist who held up a mirror to the greed and follies of his own time. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. If he were alive today, with that same sharp wit and moral compass, who would he write about? What modern-day alchemists and charlatans would he be putting on stage for all of us to picture this? It's the 16th century. Europe is just a whirlwind of new ideas. And in this era, a single book, a well-written pamphlet could literally change the destiny of a nation just as much as an army could. With just ink and paper, you could build a country's entire story, or you could tear down its faith. Today, we're going to look at two men who did exactly that. So it really makes you wonder, right? How does a nation actually figure out who it is? We're diving into the lives of two men who lived at the very same time but answered that question in completely different ways. One of them looked deep into the past to map out a country's identity, while the other, well, he called for a radical break to forge a brand new one. On one side, you've got William Camden, an English scholar whose life's mission was to carefully document every piece of his nation's history. And on the other, John Knox, a fiery Scottish preacher whose goal was nothing less than a complete spiritual revolution for his country. Two very different men, two very different missions, but both knew the incredible power of the written word. All right, so let's kick things off with the chronicler, William Camden. This was a man who truly believed that to understand England's future, you had to first understand every single inch of its past. So who was this guy, William Camden? Well, he was a historian and an antiquarian living right in the thick of the Elizabethan era. And his life's work wasn't just about writing down a list of kings and battles. It was about creating this huge, comprehensive portrait of England itself. Now, you might be hearing that word antiquarian and thinking, what on earth is that? Well, think of it like being a historical detective. An antiquarian doesn't just read old books. They study objects, places, local traditions, all of it, to piece together a much richer, more tangible story of what happened. This approach was pretty revolutionary at the time, and Camden was a real pioneer. And all that detective work led to his absolute masterpiece, a book called Britannia. When it came out in 1586, it wasn't just another dusty old chronicle. It's actually considered one of the very first modern histories of England. And that's all because of the incredible method he used to put it together.
So, what made his approach so special? It was this amazing three-step process. First up, the geographic survey. He would describe counties, towns, and important sites in incredible detail. Then, he'd do his primary source analysis, digging into original documents and records. And finally, the magic step. He would create a historical account that wove England's history directly into its physical landscape. Combining these things, it was a total game changer. And this really gets to the heart of it. Britannia was basically a map of the land and its stories, all in one. His attention to detail was so legendary that his book became the go-to reference for generations of historians who came after him. The impact of this book was enormous. Seriously, Britannia gave the English people a unified, shared story that was literally rooted in the ground beneath their feet. And it wasn't just text. The use of maps and illustrations was a huge deal back then. It helped create this powerful new sense of national heritage. And why does that matter? Because by defining a single coherent English story, Camden's work helped build an identity that would later fuel everything from national pride to the very idea of a British Empire. Okay, so now let's do a complete 180. Because while Camden was carefully piecing together the past, our next figure, John Knox, was trying to just shatter it. He wasn't mapping a nation's history, he was trying to reforge its soul. John Knox was a Scottish Protestant reformer, a major player in the Reformation, that huge religious movement that challenged the Catholic Church all across Europe. But Knox wasn't a quiet scholar in a library. He was a revolutionary preacher who believed Scotland needed a radical, brand new spiritual path. And if you want to understand his style, you don't have to look any further than the title of his most famous pamphlet, published in 1558. I mean, just look at that. It's not a subtle academic paper, it's a blast of a trumpet meant to wake people up and cause a stir. He wasn't exactly pulling any punches. What's truly wild here is what he was actually arguing. He was directly attacking the right of queens to rule, specifically targeting figures like Mary I of England. His argument, based on his reading of the Bible, was that female rulers were unnatural and against God's will. I mean, this was a direct assault on the entire political and religious order of the time. And his ideas hit like a lightning bolt. Just look at this timeline. In 1558, he publishes his first blast. Just 2 years later, in 1560, he's a co-author of the Scots Confession, which becomes the foundational document for a whole new church. And by the time he dies in 1572, the entire religious landscape of Scotland had been changed forever. So that document, the Scots Confession, you can think of it as the mission statement for the brand new Church of Scotland. It totally rejected the Pope's authority and laid out the core beliefs that would come to define Scottish Presbyterianism. And this is so important because it didn't just change how people worshipped, it carved out a cultural and political identity for Scotland that was totally distinct from its Anglican neighbor, England, shaping their complicated relationship for centuries to come. So here we are, two men separated by a border, but both using the incredible power of their writing. You've got Camden, the careful builder of a national story, and Knox, the fiery architect of a new national faith. When you put their legacies side by side, it's pretty stunning. They couldn't be more different, yet both are so foundational. Camden gave England the groundwork for modern history and a deep, shared heritage that brought the nation together. Knox, on the other hand, became the father of Scottish Presbyterianism, giving Scotland a new theological and cultural identity that deliberately set it apart. And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. When it comes to shaping a nation, or even just ourselves, what's more powerful? Is it the careful, patient work of uncovering and understanding the past, like Camden did? Or is it the passionate, demanding vision for a completely different future, like the one Knox fought for? The answer, maybe, is that every nation needs a bit of both. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of history, how two writers, centuries ago, helped basically invent a nation's identity. And get this, they didn't do it with swords or armies, but with something way more powerful, stories. So let's start with a big question. Can a book really define a nation? Well, back in the super turbulent era of post-Reformation England, the country was in the middle of a major identity crisis. It needed a new story about itself, and two key authors stepped right up to the plate to write it. You see, this was a period of just immense, earth-shattering change. All the old certainties were kind of gone. People needed new ways to understand not only their place in the big wide world, but who they were as English citizens.
And into this mix steps Samuel Purchas and John Fox. You can think of them as the architects of this new English identity. They gave the country two foundational pillars for what it meant to be English. One looking outward to the rest of the globe, and the other looking inward to its faith and its soul.
Okay, so let's start with our first pillar, Samuel Purchas. This was the guy who basically through his writing brought the entire world right to the English reader's doorstep.
Now, what's really important to get is that he wasn't an explorer himself, not at all. He was more like a masterful curator, a collector of incredible stories. He spent his time gathering these firsthand accounts from sailors, traders, and missionaries, the people who were actually out there in these unknown lands. And his goal? Oh, it was crystal clear. He wanted to completely capture the public's imagination. He filled his books with these amazing tales of triumph and danger from faraway places. And in doing so, he made the whole idea of global exploration popular for the average person. And man, this guy wrote a lot. His work covered pretty much everything from thrilling travel stories to really deep philosophical journeys. He was tackling history, geography, theology, you name it. He was painting this huge, comprehensive picture of the world for his readers. The sheer scale of his most famous work was just staggering. We're talking 4 massive volumes containing more than 100 different accounts of voyages. It basically became the must-have encyclopedia for the age of exploration. So here's the crucial point, right? Purchas wasn't just telling adventure stories for fun. He was providing a framework, a lens, through which England would see the entire world. And this would go on to shape everything, from its colonial ambitions to how it interacted with native peoples. Okay, so let's move on to our second pillar, John Fox, and see how this all connects. Because while Purchas was looking outward at the world, Fox was looking inward. He was helping to define the very soul of this new Protestant England. You know, he was a historian, sure, but he was also a really powerful propagandist for the Protestant Reformation. And his main tool wasn't complicated arguments. It was stories, unforgettable, often brutal stories of people who had died for their faith. I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. Second only to the Bible. That's how huge this book was. Most people just called it Fox's Book of Martyrs, and it was a total cultural phenomenon. You'd find it in churches and homes all across the country. It was absolutely essential reading. Foxy was a master storyteller. He used incredibly dramatic language, vivid imagery, and in later editions, he even included these intense engravings to create this powerful narrative of Protestant heroism, faith, and ultimately, sacrifice. And this shows his methods so brilliantly. He basically created a formula, a repeatable story arc. It went something like this. A person is persecuted, they stay true to their faith, they die a heroic death, and boom, they become a national hero. This playbook built a powerful shared memory for the new Church of England.
So you've got these two monumental works, right? How did they come together? How did these two very different books build one single national story?
Well, this table really lays it out perfectly. One book, Purchas's, was mapping the physical world and England's new expanding place in it. The other, Fox's, was mapping the nation's spiritual world, defining its religious identity and what it stood for.
You could honestly boil it down to this. One gave England a map of the world, and the other gave England a map of its soul. And together, they provided a complete instruction manual for what it meant to be English in this new era. Adventurous, proudly Protestant, and believing you had a special destiny on the world stage. And the legacy of all this? Wow. It's just immense. It's a perfect example of the incredible power of the printed word to literally shape the course of history. You have to understand, these weren't just dusty old history books collecting facts on a shelf. No way. They were active tools in nation building. They gave English readers a shared past to be proud of and a really compelling vision for their future. And ultimately, their combined influence created this sense of purpose that wasn't just some abstract idea. It directly fueled the nation's ambitions, everything from exploration to colonization for centuries to come. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If these books could help build an empire back then, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What modern stories, what media, what narratives are writing the next chapter of our world right now? Today, we're talking about a man who arguably did more to build the British Empire than any single explorer or general. And the craziest part? He did it all from his study. He was the ultimate salesman for a global vision, and his most powerful weapon was information. So how on earth did he pull it off? First up, we're going to see how he was basically the 16th century's first influencer. Then we'll dive into the massive imperial vision he was selling to anyone who would listen. After that, we'll check out his masterpiece, a collection of travel stories that made it all feel so real. We'll even look in his specific playbook for colonizing America before unpacking the huge legacy he left behind. You know, when you picture the age of exploration, you probably imagine guys in big hats on the decks of ships, right? Adventurers on the high seas. Well, this story is about a completely different kind of pioneer. It really does sound like a trick question, doesn't it? Our minds jump to guys like Sir Francis Drake or Sir Walter Raleigh, you know, the ones who actually went out there. But the man who arguably provided the intellectual and moral fuel for their voyages was someone who much preferred libraries to longships. And the answer is Richard Hakluyt. Think of him as a geographer, a historian, and most importantly, one of the most effective promoters in English history. See, his battlefield wasn't the open ocean, it was the world of ideas, politics, and pure persuasion. So here's the crucial thing to understand. Hakluyt's job wasn't to discover new lands himself. Nope. His role was to convince the people with power and money, we're talking the Queen, wealthy investors, the public, that overseas expansion was absolutely essential for England's future. He was, for all intents and purposes, the chief marketing officer for an empire. But make no mistake, Hakluyt wasn't just some dusty academic collecting maps. No. He was an architect, building a national ambition, a huge, grand vision for what England could be. This right here was his core belief. You have to remember, back in the late 1500s, England was kind of nervously looking over its shoulder at Spain, which was getting fantastically rich from its American colonies. Hakluyt's argument was simple. To compete, to survive, to prosper, England had to get in the game. It had to build its own overseas empire. And his method? Well, it's fascinating. The man was a master of information warfare. He wasn't just a collector, he was a curator. He took these raw stories from sailors and merchants, and then he would edit them. He'd cut out the disastrous parts, amplify the successes, and make absolutely sure to highlight the immense profits to be made. In short, he was creating the ultimate highlight reel for English exploration. Okay, so to sell this incredible dream, Hakluyt knew he needed a product, something tangible. And what he created was, honestly, one of the most influential books of the entire era. A massive, compelling collection of what he presented as proof that England was destined for greatness. I mean, just listen to that title. It's epic, right? And that was exactly the point. This thing wasn't just a book, it was a national epic in prose. He pulled together every single scrap of information he could get his hands on. We're talking personal journals, official letters, ship's logs, you name it, from English adventurers all over the world. And the sheer size of this thing was part of the message. The very first edition had over 50 different accounts. It was like he was holding it up to his readers and saying, look at all the stuff we've already done. Now just imagine what we can do next. It was the proof of concept for a global empire. And this chart gives you a pretty good idea of just how big his vision was. By pulling all these stories together, he was basically drawing a blueprint for England's global ambitions. He wasn't just focused on North America. Oh no. He had accounts from the Caribbean, from Africa, from all the way over in Asia. He was laying out the entire world as a potential stage for English enterprise. But here's the thing, Hakluyt wasn't just a historian looking at the past. He was a total strategist, always looking to the future. And he put it all down in a very specific and very confidential proposal that outlined exactly what England's next move should be. And that proposal was this document right here. The title basically just means an argument for colonizing the West. This was his secret playbook. And this wasn't some pamphlet for the masses. This was an eyes-only, direct pitch to the Queen and her top advisors, laying out the strategic case for setting up permanent colonies in North America. And his plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Really, he boiled it all down to 4 key points. First up, money. Secure resources, open up new trade routes, make England rich. Second, geopolitics. He wanted to stick it to the Spanish Empire by building an English base right in their backyard. Third, ideology. A huge part of the pitch was about spreading Protestant Christianity. And finally, the endgame. Build permanent settlements. This wasn't about a smash and grab. It was a comprehensive, compelling business plan for colonization. So you have to ask, what was the upshot of all this? Did all this writing and promoting actually work? Well, yeah.
And his arguments didn't just convince people back then. Their impact would literally change the map of the world for centuries to come. In the end, Hakluyt's work became the foundational story for English expansion, the narrative everyone bought into. He didn't just record history, you see, he actively shaped it. He articulated a vision that directly inspired the colonization of places like Virginia. He gave England the arguments, the motivation, and the roadmap that helped transform it into a global maritime power and set the course for the British Empire. And all of this leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? Richard Hakluyt's story is this incredible reminder that empires aren't just built with ships and swords, they're built with words, with ideas. It really makes you stop and think, how much of the world we live in today was first dreamed up not by a soldier or a king, but by a masterful storyteller who knew exactly how to sell. Okay, let me ask you a question. If I say revenge tragedy, what's the first play that pops into your head? It's probably Hamlet, right? Well, what if I told you that the real architect, the guy who invented the whole genre, is someone you've probably never even heard of? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Thomas Kyd, the unsung hero, or maybe the ghost of theater history.
Right, we all know Hamlet, the moody prince in black talking to skulls. But his whole story, the grief, the anger, the quest for vengeance, believe it or not, that wasn't the first of its kind to blow the minds of London audiences. Nope. Before Hamlet, there was a guy named Hieronymo. And if you're sitting there going, Hieronymo? Who? Well, you've hit on exactly what we're here to talk about.
So the man behind this mystery character, Hieronymo, was Thomas Kyd. He was writing around the same time as Shakespeare, and with just one absolutely explosive play, he created the blueprint for the entire genre. He didn't just write a cool story, he literally forged the template for revenge that would completely dominate the English stage for years to come. So what even is a revenge tragedy? Well, at its core, it's a story about a hero who's out to get payback for a terrible wrong. But it's so much more than just sword fights and action. It's a deep dive, you know? It explores that razor-thin line between justice and pure madness, and the really brutal cost of taking the law into your own hands. And Kyd's masterpiece, the play that kicked this all off, was called The Spanish Tragedy. It's about Hieronymo, a Spanish court official whose son is just brutally murdered. And when he realizes the system, the official channels of justice, are totally corrupt and are going to do nothing, he decides to go on his own dark, twisted path to get even. And let me tell you, this play was a smash hit. So what was it about this play that made it so revolutionary? See, Kyd wasn't just telling a sad story. He was mixing together this powerful formula, a recipe for revenge that was just packed with psychological thrills and incredible theater. So let's break down the secret ingredients he used. Kyd's formula basically boils down to 5 key elements, and they feel incredibly modern. You start with a really gruesome murder to kick things off. Then you get a ghost who shows up demanding revenge. Our hero, wrestling with all this grief, starts to act crazy, maybe even goes mad for real. Then, and this is my favorite part, he puts on a play inside the play to trap his enemies, and it all ends in an absolutely chaotic, bloody finale. Sound familiar? It should. But Kyd's real genius wasn't just the plot points. It was how deep he went into his character's head. He basically popularized the soliloquy, giving us a direct window into Hieronymo's mind. It's that moment where the hero is alone on stage, speaking his darkest, most private thoughts right to the audience. This created this incredible emotional connection that, when you mix it with all the suspense, was just electric. It was totally new. But here's the thing. Kyd wasn't a one-trick pony. Not at all. I mean, yeah, The Spanish Tragedy is what made him famous, but he was a really versatile writer. He explored all sorts of different themes, which shows us that his talent went way beyond just revenge. Just look at his range here. On one hand, you've got the vengeance and madness of the Spanish tragedy. But then he also wrote Cornelia, which is this formal classical tragedy all about Roman politics and family loyalty, with a really strong woman at its center. And we even have records showing he wrote a comedy called The Householder. It's lost now, sadly. But the point is, the guy we think of for all the blood and guts could do so much more. Okay, so let's bring this all back to where we started. We've seen Kyd's blueprint for revenge. Now let's look at the enduring echo of his work, specifically how it shows up in the plays of the most famous playwright in history, William Shakespeare. The connection here is it's undeniable. Seriously, look at this. A ghost demanding vengeance? That's Hamlet. A hero who pretends to be crazy to get what he wants? Hamlet again. The brilliant use of a play within a play to expose the killer, that's the climax of Hamlet.
Even one of Shakespeare's earliest and most violent plays, Titus Andronicus, owes a huge, massive debt to Kyde's work. Shakespeare didn't just invent these ideas out of thin air. He was refining and perfecting a template that Thomas Kyde created first.
So Kyde's legacy is just immense when you think about it. He was a master of the complicated plot, a true pioneer of psychological drama. By making the soliloquy a popular tool, he gave characters an inner life that audiences could really latch onto. He didn't just influence Shakespeare, he shaped the entire direction of English tragedy. He set the stage, literally, for everyone who came after him.
And here's the really tragic part of this whole story. Kyde died young, only 35 years old. And because of that, a lot of his work, like that comedy, The Householder, is just gone, lost to time. The incredible, massive influence we're talking about today comes from just a fraction of what he actually wrote. Just imagine what else he might have created. So we'll end on this thought. In a way, Kyde himself is like a ghost in the history of theater. He's rarely seen, his name isn't up in lights, but his influence is absolutely everywhere. His innovations haunt the halls of drama, echoing through some of the greatest plays ever written. So you have to wonder, right? How different would the stage really be without the ghost of Thomas?
Okay, so let's jump right in. We're about to travel back 400 years to meet a guy whose advice on living a good life feels like it could have been written yesterday. That man is Francis Bacon. He was a huge deal in 17th century England, a philosopher, a scientist, and a statesman. But honestly, his most lasting legacy might just be his essays, which are this incredibly practical guide for navigating, our own minds, our relationships, and even our careers. Now, to really get Bacon, you first have to understand his big idea, and that is empiricism. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It was this pretty radical idea that we shouldn't just trust Instead, real knowledge comes from actually